85 years ago, in a remote corner of Tibet, a little boy was born to a poor farming family. One day, miraculously, he was discovered to be the reincarnation of the 13th Dalai Lama, and he was soon carried away to the capital city of Lhasa to become the next political and spiritual leader of the vast kingdom of Tibet. But the little boy had a secret locked inside his heart.
Since my childhood, I love technology. If I had not become Dalai Lama, I'd still remain in my native place. Then eventually, so I may be engineer or electrician.
Since childhood, always a curiosity to develop something new things to see. I always develop the question, why, how, always happen.
I think really introduced about technology is some small toy,
Small machines. Then I play a few moments, and then out of my curiosity, I always open this manner.
I think maybe 50-50 chance to reassemble. 50 fail.
And that actually not much interest for study. I'm a really very, very lazy student. I always prefer play. One movie projector which belongs to 13th Dalai Lama. Because it's quite old, so quite often you see breakdown. Small dynamo, produce electricity. Then I began to realize AC, DC, how it works. So then gradually, you develop interest about science. I have a keen interest about cosmology. My telescope, I used to use it look to moon. Then I found some rock mountains. Western side, shadow there. East side, no shadow. Moon, no light, but light only from sun. There, one full moon night, I arranged my telescope and I invited my tutor. Please look whether light come from sun. So they seriously watch and then agree. Yes, moon, no light. Light come from sun. So then, 1954, when I was in Peking, China, we visit huge hydroelectricity factory.
I have a keen interest. And then you say asking some questions to those engineer or electrician way. Oh, the differences of AC and DC and these things.
And then also you see difference of the factories. I think I was the only person fully alert to see how it can work.
The Communist Chinese Army entered Tibet in 1950, and despite the many months that the young Dalai Lama spent in high-level meetings in Beijing, when he returned to Lhasa, negotiations with Chinese government leaders soon began to fail, and tensions started to rise. In 1959, rumors of a Chinese government plot to kidnap the Dalai Lama caused 300,000 Tibetan people to surround the Dalai Lama's palace, creating a human wall to protect him. The Dalai Lama was able to secretly leave in the middle of the night in a daring escape. 4 days later, the Chinese army took action to disperse the crowd around the palace, and fighting broke out in Lhasa. This fighting soon spread across Tibet, and thousands died in the aftermath. Many Tibetan families escaped from Tibet to join the Dalai Lama in India, where Prime Minister Nehru had granted him land.
At the age of 16, I lost my freedom. At the age 24, I lost my own country.
And yet, over time, he was able to create one of the most successful refugee communities in the world, run by a democratically elected Tibetan government in exile, with the rebuilding of the monasteries, now in India, and with the preservation of Tibet's unique Buddhist science, philosophy, spiritual traditions, language, and culture. Gradually, the Dalai Lama began to have opportunities to begin meeting with leading scientists.
David Bohm, von Weizsäcker, and some other great scientists. These people become my friend, and not only friend, but von Weizsäcker and David Bohm, I consider my own teacher. of physics, generally and particularly quantum physics.
But science is always seen as measurement. Is that no longer true?
Well, science is whatever people make of it. You see, science has changed over the ages, and it's different now from a few hundred years ago. It could be different again. Now, there's no intrinsic reason why science must necessarily be measurement. This is another historical development which has come about over the past few centuries. It's entirely contingent and not absolutely necessary.
And when Einstein produced his special theory, which the Times newspaper of London dismissed as being nonsense, was he moving towards wholeness?
Yes, he definitely was. He moved eventually toward a view of field theory where everything was one field, all the fields merging. So it was a step toward wholeness, although not, it was a limited step, but still it was the beginning.
David Bohm and Carl von Weizsäcker explained that the great minds which created the current field of quantum physics at the turn of the century, Einstein, Bohr, and others, created their groundbreaking theories through thought experiments alone, not by carrying out experiments in the lab. Thought experiments which were similar to those created by leading scholars in the various schools of Tibetan science.
Physics, like quantum physics, very similar. The mathematical philosophy's view. Nothing exists by objectively. Wonderful.
After that visit, the Dalai Lama met with a new group of scientists.
I met his Holiness in '83 in an international conference. Immediately, the charm of his keen intelligence, totally unassuming, just pure interest. I was very touched by that. And we're in the middle of this conversation. His assistants were pulling him by the arm. Holiness, let's go. And then he said, why don't you come to Dharamsala and we can continue these discussions.
It was in February of 1985 that phone rang. I'm Francisco Varela calling from Paris. I understand that you're trying to put together a science meeting with the Dalai Lama.
I was a friend of Francisco Varela's, and Adam Engel came down to the Ojai Foundation and met with us, and we sat under this big oak tree, and we discussed connection between interests that Francisco and I had and what Adam and Michael Saltman wanted to do.
And I remember really clearly, he said, don't do physics, do cognitive science.
It was a really good fit between Adam and Francisco. They had complementary skills, and so the whole thing began to unfold. It was very, very extraordinary to watch it. I mean, it happened.
The most interesting things that happen in evolution, and therefore the most useful thing to explain the diversity of life, are internal factors rather than selective pressure. Yes, it is true that if the planet goes very cold, animals have to change. But how they change, how they go about it, is the result of internal factors, much more so than external factors. It is as if external factors impose very broad constraints, but cannot possibly determine what will happen. And I find this very interesting because it's an exact parallel of what we saw in perception. That yes, we need light and we need some stimulation in the retina. Those are the constraints. But what we see depends on the internal factors. And the two together give rise then to some kind of a stable perception. Well, here it seems to be much the same thing. The environment gives some kind of constraints, internal factors, then species and evolution.
His explanation, very clear, I think very precise, very helpful. A person who have real authority in certain scientific field, at the same time, personally practicing Buddha Dharma, that's I think quite rare. So you see, he can explain with a more fuller knowledge of both fields, science and Buddhist philosophy. So that's very useful, helpful, certainly.
It was actually like a huge comet. That's right. But of such dimension that just the collision evaporated the seas for the next, many years. It was purely in terms of clouds. That meant that, the dramatic impact of life, at that point, life virtually was abolished. Who stayed? As I mentioned yesterday, our little friends. They were untouched.
That was good.
We might wipe ourselves out of the planet with atomic bombs, and that probably wouldn't end life on the planet. So in fact, from that point of view, you can reverse the tree and put the bacteria on top. They are the best. We are very so-so, because in fact, we have made our environment so fragile.
So the result, the serious discussion with scientists, then it becomes clear. This kind of discussion with scientists is mutual benefit.
And then after it was over, I looked at His Holiness again and I said, well, you want to do it again? And he said, yes.
On the day of the second meeting, we got a call from Oslo, Norway. The Dalai Lama had just won the Nobel Peace Prize.
And I will call on you as you raise your hand. We're open for questions.
Why do you think you were chosen for this prize, and don't be humble?
I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think last 30 years, become a refugee. You see, desperate situation. Yet, I follow strictly with my own, according to my own principle, non-violence. I think that's the main reason.
Later on, I learned that some of his advisors had said, you have to cancel this science conference because this is a great opportunity, but he refused to do so. His commitment was to the scientists. Here he was. He just won the Nobel Prize, and he was still perfectly present, calm, steady, impressive.
The vast majority of scientists were skeptical.
Now, when I first sat down with the Dalai Lama, it was actually quite surprising. See, I had the stereotype vision of an Asian spiritual master as kind of floating on a cloud. They're going to be kind of transcendent, eyes half closed, occasionally saying perhaps inscrutable things. But here, I'm sitting down across from him. I had this feeling I was across from a wrestler, intellectually. He was taking my ideas and he was grabbing them and testing them.
Now, I would like to show experimental evidence for the atom. Are there techniques, like a microscope, or some technique which will allow us to see even a single atom? Now, until very recently, this was impossible. But within the last 10 to 15 years, we now have very interesting evidence. There's a laser which comes in, shines on the atom, illuminates the atom, and then the light is given off, and we can see it. You see a tiny, tiny pinpoint of light from this single atom. So this looks...
It
is through the telescope.
Through a microscope?
Yes, it's with naked eye. Naked eye. Naked eye. It's so bright. It's so bright. It's very small, but it's extremely bright. It doesn't move. No, it's localized in a very small region. It's a very, very small region. It's ion trap.
He would ask something and then throw something back at me and back and forth. He's like this. He's got his arms a little bit outside. And he's going,
Isn't it the case that the atoms are always in a constant dynamic flux?
You can ask, is it possible when one comes to an absolute zero temperature, and you can go no further, are the atoms completely still? Classically, the answer would be yes, in classical physics. In quantum mechanics, it turns out the answer is no. Because quantum mechanically, the atoms must always have a small motion. This is This is an experimental fact now. You can watch the motion decrease until you reach a threshold, and then it flattens out, and the motion continues at that level, no matter how cold you go.
But the shit, we're talking about the Big Bang issue, right? Quite right. The Big Bang magic won't touch you.
That's in terms of the
day. I don't know about that. But the space particle job, don't you stay over? Quite a barrel.
In terms of the Big Bang, there needs to be something to kind of ignite the Big Bang. If it really is a bang of sorts, then there needs to be something that ignites that Big Bang. But if prior to the Big Bang, it is absolutely cold, then how could there be any ignition? How could there be anything to catalyze it?
I expected somebody that was kind of disconnected from reality and in a spiritual fog. What I found was a person completely present. Surprising.
Since over 30 years, we developed serious discussion with many scientists, mainly from America, 5 fields: cosmology, quantum physics, psychology, neuroscience, then biology.
The dialogues focused in detail on cosmology.
George Greenstein was a colleague of mine at Amherst College.
When thinking about the origin of the universe, we have a lot of facts that we know, but they lead us to a gigantic question. We do not know how to deal with all matter occupying exactly the same space. And we also do not know how to deal with all matter having infinite energy. Was the Big Bang creation, or was it simply a stage in the evolution of the universe? Did the universe exist prior to the Big Bang and pass through this state and then come into the current state, or was the universe created at that instant?
So what do you mean by creation?
I mean, prior to the Big Bang, there was nothing, and after the Big Bang, there was a lot.
But you creation.
So would you say something that is caused event is a creation? If you say that the universe comes from a cause, would that be considered a creation?
I want to ask you that question. Third possibility. The universe existed, contracted to a bounce, expanded, stopped, contracted to another bounce, and this way endlessly. An endless series of cycles.
Yes. So,
beginningless.
No. So to relate this story, that you told of the different options, the speculations that physicists have come up with, the Buddhist position seems to be much closer to the third option, where there is this constant expansion and shrinking and then coming into being again, this repeated dissolution and the origination of the universe. One thing that we need to bear in mind is that this idea in a repeated kind of dissolution and origination of the universe does not necessarily suggest that the same kind of universe will come into existence over and over again.
Same elements, all that.
And also out of
cells, all
very elements as well.
No.
So you can envision a new universe with a whole set of new properties and elements that may not be the same as the one that existed before. And here, of course, from the Buddhist point of view, karma has a role to play.
One thing I would like to mention, however, is that the idea of our planet being the center of the universe, this anthropocentric, was never in the picture. From the sutras, they speak from the beginning of billion-fold universe. Ours being a small unit, 1,000 of those being a secondary unit, 1,000 of those secondary units being a tertiary unit. That means a billion-fold universe. They speak of universe being like curtains of lights, like horses spouting fires, wheels of lights, all these beautiful images that you seem to be already looking in the Hubble telescope. But still, the idea that there was almost infinite possibilities, universes, and therefore beginninglessness also as another thing. There must have been life, there must have been consciousness in all those billion universes. So in a way, our Big Bang is a very, very small part of history from that perspective.
His Holiness says that he has 100% support for Matthew when he contrasts the problems, the imagination problem versus the logical problem with respect to beginning and beginninglessness. So the idea that we can imagine, it's easier for imagination when we say there is a beginning, but logically we have more problem. But it's harder to imagine when you say it's beginningless, but logically that seems to be more in tune with reason.
The knowledge about cosmology, Big Bang, these things. In principle, the Buddhist sort was cosmology explanation, quite similar.
The dialogues also focused on quantum physics.
What you see here is a little laser which emits light. These particles go in one after the other, Okay? There is a contradiction here. On the one hand, we have individual particles which can go through one slit only at a time. On the other hand, we have the stripes which indicate that there are waves which go through both slits. How can something go through one slit and to both slits at the same time? This is now a very important point, which is new in modern physics, is that the observer experimentalist decides which of the two features, particle or wave, is reality. So the observer has a very strong influence on nature. There is no reason why in this run of the experiment you get this result. And this is really the first time in physics that we see something like that. That we see events for which we cannot build a chain of reasoning. Some people even said that what we observe in the individual quantum event is a spontaneous act of creation. So, with this, I think I have finished my exposition of the quantum physics of individual particles. And as the next one, I would like to go to the quantum physics of two or more particles, which also has its own deep mysteries for us. The notion which we use to describe connectedness of two particles, the name is entanglement. So the idea is that these two particles, even if they are separated over a very large distance, they always remain one system. They're not really separated.
So when we're talking about dependency here, the fact that what happens here on one side seems to be dependent on what happens on the other side. We're not talking in terms of causal dependence, are we?
That is a very deep question. A little illustration. Suppose you have two dice, and then at some time you throw a die and your friend throw a die. And it turns out that even as both of them are completely random, they always give the same number. How can that be? So the idea is that these two particles, even if they are separated over a very large distance, they always remain one system. They're not really separated in a deep sense.
So you're implying that the entire universe is internally entangled?
Well, that is a nice idea, but I would not want to take a position on that, because as an experimentalist, I would not know how to prove that.
但是这不如前面我们这边的菜，去台湾台湾都不如下考的，不是巧的。
So someone was saying that probably someone who can prove it will have to be able to live very long to see the whole.
He needs a lot of money.
They continued to meet.
You might ask whether everything is the same or whether something has changed in quantum physics. And there are actually two important changes. One change concerns a technical thing happening. And I know that, Your Holiness, you love technology, so I will mention that. And that is the fact that based on these fundamental questions, which we discussed already, people are developing a new technology for information. And that is really a big surprise. Now, this is a picture which tries to indicate the entanglement of many qubits. Each blue point is supposedly to be a qubit, and you have many connections here. Now, if I measure one qubit, then it changes the whole state. It does not only change the one I look at, it changes all the other ones. Then I measure another one, another qubit, and that changes the rest. And I keep going. And if I keep going the right way, in the end, I have the solution I want. This is a completely new way of thinking about computation. It's different from any computation people have been talking about. So in a sense, it's the first technical application of wholeness.
I think this subject is very important. In any case, it's those subjects which often you see create more confusion. That itself is showing more complicated. So really worthwhile to see the further discussion. And I think discussion between the scientists, those specialists in this particular field, and Buddhists. I prefer young scholars.
They are your team.
Yes, my team, yes.
Now, the second point which happened, which was actually in part encouraged, if not inspired by our earlier discussion, is some new ideas which we are developing on the conceptual foundations of quantum mechanics. We are simply asking, maybe knowledge is as fundamental or maybe even more fundamental than reality. We can very well handle this kind of paradoxical situations we have been talking about mathematically, and we can confirm them in experiment with very high precision. But we still do not know conceptually what is going on. Why is the world so strange? And what I want to see someday before I pass away, that someone explains to me why it is so strange. So I want to learn new concepts, and this is a place, and there were some new concepts brought out in your discussion, which are very interesting for me, and where I have to think more, and where I hope I learn something which might even have relevance in helping to understand some of these phenomena in physics.
So here I will insist on the critique of the idea of intrinsic existence and of the idea that they have intrinsic properties. So to begin with, science made a momentous step forward as soon as it understood that certain explanations have to be given in terms of relations rather than in terms of absolute properties. First example, the Schrödinger cat. You have a box, and inside the box, the bottle contains poison. You have a big piece of radioactive material that has the probability 1/2 to disintegrate. The state of the piece of radioactive material is in a superposition between being disintegrated and not being disintegrated. And according to quantum mechanics, the cat should be half dead and half alive. But this sounds absurd, because when you open the box and see in the box, it's not the case. You see either a dead cat or a cat which is alive. So there is a paradox.
Can I just say, maybe we should add that there is no cruelty involved here, because this is a thought
experiment.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you, John. Yes, this is perfectly right. And I must say, I've personally gone to Schrödinger's house. I've seen in his house that he had many cats. And so he loved cats.
So hopefully not experimented.
Yes, fortunately it's a thought experiment, yes, yes.
Experimenting on cats?
No. Never.
Perhaps you remember we had met 6 years ago at Stanford, and we had a discussion with a few other people for morning and lunch, and that was a very important event in my life. And since coming here, I've learned a great deal. I hope to start by addressing this question about the nature of matter and the nature of life. Now, the single most important thing we know is that the world is made of atoms. This is a picture of iron atoms put on the surface of a piece of metal. Each of these little bumps is one atom. You have to get it very, very cold for them to stay.
So maybe it's too cold to move.
Frozen. Atoms are made of other particles, such as electrons around the outside. This is very strange. Our current understanding of these particles is they have no size, infinitely small. And we describe the particle in terms of these field lines, these fields. If the atom were the size of the Earth, the size of this electron would be smaller than 1 millimeter. So we know it must be smaller than that. Now, how do we know that? We actually take electrons and we throw them at another electron. And if the electron had size, these particles of electrons would bounce from them differently than if the electron was just a point. And we can mathematically predict which is which, and what we see, no size, just point.
Whether there's anything that is, do they provide any kind of obstruction to an incoming entity? And my impression from what you just said is yes, that is, you can collide to electrons, but they collide as if they were pure points rather than having any type of spatial dimensionality.
You're absolutely correct.
When we speak of simply the existence of things in our shared world, we posit the existence of things. What is actually the nature of the electron itself, independently of its own parts that have an ontological knowledge? You don't find it. So then you're left with a couple of options. Again, you can either say, well, these elementary particles and so forth, all these things that we identify, they do things. So to say as they're doing things and things are done to them that they don't exist is foolishness.
Every property that I know of, it depends. So when we say the electron has these intrinsic properties, we don't say it has an intrinsic property. We're not going to talk about the electron as a being. It also includes the interaction. We have to include the interaction.
Because that's the observation.
Because in order to even observe the electron, we need some interaction. So in that respect, I don't think it conflicts with the Buddhist philosophy. All the others are a matter of the observation. It has, which means it intimately is connected with the rest of the world. I don't see a conflict, quite frankly.
I think maybe worthwhile to explain about basic structure of Buddha Dharma. Now I speak in Tibetan, translate.
After the Buddha's enlightenment, the Buddha was reluctant to actually give a teaching. There is a beautiful passage in the scripture which says that because I fear that no one will understand, I shall remain non-speaking and remain in the forest. All the teachings of the Buddha have been really presented from the point of view of the true truths. And he who does not understand the true truths cannot understand the essence of the Buddha's teaching. So what we are talking about here is the two levels of reality. One is the ultimate level of reality, which is the emptiness, where nothing can be found. But there is also another level of reality, which is the conventional relative level, on which causes and effect and everything function. And this ability to distinguish between two levels of reality and two truths and understanding existence in terms of these two becomes very important. In other words, Buddha is saying that it's not that nothing exists, but things don't exist in the way in which we tend to assume they do. They don't exist as they appear to us. This is what quantum physics have also discovered. As they go deeper into their understanding of what makes up the physical world, they don't find anything So they have come to realize that there is nothing that supports the objective reality of the material world that we assume. So in some sense, what the quantum physics have come to is very similar to what Buddhism has also come to. And the assumption behind all of this is that if something exists, it should be findable. Once you mentally deconstruct what makes up what seems like a solid thing in front of you, you come to recognize that nothing stands there as the true reference to which you can point and say, this is it. So therefore, Buddha says that the form is empty. And then the question arises, does that mean nothing exists? Then the second presentation is made, which is that emptiness is form. So you cannot accord a hierarchy of existence to the matter and mind, both devoid of intrinsic existence, but they do both exist on the basis of designation and causes and conditions. So they have dependent origination, but they don't have intrinsic existence.
The scientific dialogues covered the field of cognitive science as well.
Emotion which based on ignorance, such as strong anger, hatred, and also attachment. One of my American friend, one scientist, Aaron Beck, he mentioned when we develop anger, the object which we feel angry appears very negative, but actually 90% of that negativeness is mental projection.
Find is that when we get a negative image of somebody else and it stays on and on, we start to attack the other person, but actually we're attacking the image. By attacking this image of the person, we're actually injuring the person who may be nothing like the image. So the more we have the negative image of the person, the more we're going to attack him, but it's always the image that we're having that is bothering us, not the real person. So we talked about delusion before, in a way.
Yes.
A lot of hatred is based on a delusion, but it's also between countries, nations, ethnic groups. They tend to have kind of an image, a mental image of the other people as some way subhuman. Let's say when the Germans would have pictures of the Russians during World War II, they show the Russians as looking like beasts, wild beasts. Then, of course, the people felt it's okay to shoot wild beasts because they're not human beings anymore.
So I think the Buddhist concept, all these negative emotions based on ignorance or misconception.
Holiness, just apart for one moment, you mentioned about the broad perspective before, and I think much of the unhappiness that individuals have is because they lose perspective. And I thought I'd give you an example. There was some time ago, I was asked to consult about a professor of physics, and he thought that he had made a very great discovery which might give him the Nobel Prize. And he got passed over. He did not get the Nobel Prize, and so he was depressed. And so I said, well, how important part of your life was this prize? And he said, 100%. So I asked him, I said, do you have a family? And he said, oh, yes. And I said, well, how important is your family to you? So he said, my wife, 20%. And I said, do you have children? And he said, yes, I have 3 children. And I said, how important are they to you? And he said, oh, I guess they're about 40%. And I said, do you get to see your children very much? He said, well, no, I've had so much time working on my physics project that I really haven't spent much time with them. And I said, how do you feel about that? And then he started to weep. And I said, why are you weeping? He says, it reminded me when I was growing up, that's just the way my father was to me. And he said, now I suddenly realize what I am missing out on. My father missed out on it, I'm missing out, and of course my children are missing out. So I said, now how important are your children to you now? And he said, 80%. Anyhow, he left the office, and he wasn't depressed anymore.
Well, very wise. I think right method. That we call exactly analytical meditation.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Sometimes I express, compare ancient Indian psychology, particularly Buddhist psychology. Modern psychology looks like a kindergarten level.
Well, I'm a secularist. The only reason I met the Dalai Lama was because of my daughter. And I knew that if you got invited to his palace in Dharamsala, you got to bring a single observer. And I thought, what a kick this would be for my daughter. And so although I thought this was just another one of the Bay Area fads, I figured, okay, I'll make an exception, I'll go.
We start with Paul Ekman, professor of psychology and director of the Laboratory for Human Interaction at the University of California Medical School in San Francisco. But what you really should know about him is that he is a master of the face and of emotions, and of reading emotions, and he has more than 30 years of world-class research.
For inexplicable reasons, he and I really connected. I felt like I'd known him all my life.
And that the function of emotion is to get us moving, active, very quickly, without having to think. But most of the things we become emotional about are things we have learned in the course of growing up. And the issue, which I will get to later, is can we unlearn some of them? So what I've been doing is trying to distinguish many different important states. The emotions, the moods, resentment, hatred. One of the reasons why we have so much difficulty once we become emotional is that the emotion itself enslaves us. There is what I would like to call a refractory period. That is a period in which new information doesn't enter. Or if it enters, interpretation is biased. That refractory period may be only a few seconds, or it may be much longer. As long as it's occurring, we can't get out of the grip of that emotion. I want to say that after spending more than 35 years studying emotion, I'm impressed about how little we still know about it.
When we met and tried to think, what do we mean by destructive emotions? We came up with the definition, emotions that harm self or others. Your definition is extremely subtle. Your definition of destructive emotions is what disturbs the calm of the mind.
Yeah. I'm Buddhist. My ultimate goal is Buddhahood. This is my business.
And how can we educate our emotions? By what means? Without becoming Buddhists.
So therefore,
there's a possibility here that even though the grasping at the intrinsic reality of self, or whatever it is, the object, has arisen, one could prolong the causal process between that instance of grasping and the actual arisal of the affliction.
So, in terms of really a precise analysis, what takes place, let's say, in the first instant of apprehending a flower, the very first instant you simply apprehend the flower without reification, you're simply apprehending the flower itself. In the next instant, that is a valid cognition. But normally speaking, in the second instant, then there's the reification of the flower, and as soon as that reification of the flower takes place, then you're into a false cognition. And so Thomas concludes here, it is to be seen whether you can find the precise neural correlate of the mere apprehension of the flower versus the very next instant of the reification of the flower. And so it would be very interesting to see whether by studying the brain you will be able to discern the difference between a valid cognition and an invalid cognition.
In addition, the dialogues focused on the field of neuroscience.
Neurobiology, wonderful. I think if we properly sort of study this and get some knowledge, I think it can serve 7 billion human beings.
The Dalai Lama invited me to come meet with him because he was interested in catalyzing serious neuroscientific research on the mind and brains of Tibetan practitioners that spent years cultivating their minds. And in fact, on that momentous day in 1992, he was quite stern in a way. And he challenged me and he said, "You've been using the tools of modern neuroscience to investigate depression and anxiety and stress and fear. Why can't you use those same tools to study kindness and compassion?" And for me, it was a wake-up call. I didn't have a very good answer other than that it's hard.
Scientific collaboration and research began in earnest, even though neuroscientist Francisco Varela became seriously ill. And a conference on neuroscience was organized in the year of 2000 for the presentation of their results.
I wanted to tell you. You know, Francisco got very ill in 1997 with the cancer, and then after that he had to make the decision to have the transplantation of the liver. He had to decide to die or to live. And at that time he was thinking that he did not want to do the transplant. Then he received a fax from you where you said, "You must do everything to get healthy and keep working and practicing and doing science." And he said, "This is a message to me to make the right decision, to live." And he made the right decision thanks to you.
Scientist.
Your Holiness, this afternoon, or now, what I'd like to turn to is the theme of the meeting on destructive emotions and talk about some antidotes to destructive emotions and how we can think about those antidotes in neuroscientific terms. And one question which we have pursued, whether meditation will have effects in a long-term way on this area of the brain. A more formal experiment that we have recently completed with Jon Kabat-Zinn, who presented to Your Holiness at a previous Mind and Life meeting. Jon Kabat-Zinn has been developing methods to use mindfulness meditation in a large variety of populations, including medical patients, employees in the workplace. He conducted the training himself. We wanted to explore the extent to which these factors of brain activity can be changed in normal lay people. The logic in this experiment was to see whether antidotes to stress, meditation, can have a beneficial effect on the immune system. So at the end of the study, the participants got the vaccine. The finding that we are actually the most excited about because it's so unusual and it has never been demonstrated before, and that is when we vaccinated them with the influenza vaccine, we actually find that the meditation group shows a stronger response to the influenza vaccine compared to the control group. We will be repeating this study with measures using MRI, which allow us to look deep within the brain so that we can actually look at the amygdala. We are energized with vigor and zeal to pursue this in the future, and we hope to continue this kind of collaboration.
Your Holiness, like my colleagues before, just a little thought before we begin. It seems to me truly wondrous that I'm here again with you once more. We have done experiments with audition, with memory, with conflict of attention between visual and auditory. The answer is always the same. The transitoriness of mental factors is like they come and they go. And what we have here is a correlate in this green stuff. That was, for me, the big discovery, that the brain actively undoes itself. So it creates like gaps where, the transition from one moment to the next is actually marked. So you have recognition and then action, but they are punctuated. It's like, saying perception, comma, action. You don't just put them in a flow and you continue. This is, again, what we were talking about the other day, that time lasts a little bit. And in fact, last here, you can see the first moment of time of the recognition is about a third of a second. Then another similar moment when you do an action, which is pushing the button. And this is systematic. We've seen this in all kinds of different conditions.
So I said just to see whether you agree that this corroborates according to Buddhist psychology. And that is, in the first moment, is a purely visual perception, which is non-conceptual. In the second moment, whatever duration of that moment happens to be, then the conceptual mind apprehends this is this.
Absolutely. You cannot compress a moment beyond typically normal conditions 150 milliseconds. Even it's something almost immediate, it's about 160 milliseconds. This moment of arising is another whoomp. So the brain works by these whoops, and whatever it is, whether it's visual perception of a field, whether it is close your eyes and you have a mental image, it's the same thing. Then to really conclude, Your Holiness, my point is that this was done with somebody who is not really highly trained. But what we want to do is to take highly trained people, like meditators, who can actually go into much more fine detail what was the moment of experience. And for example, we want to work with the monasteries in Dordogne, in the south of France. And in May, for example, we hope to have Matthew come to the lab and do these kinds of experiments. So if we can find differences even with ordinary people, then with more expert people, we should be able to really go into much finer detail. So with that thought, I wanted to conclude, because this is where, to me, there is a true possibility of collaboration, not just in principle, but in a very concrete sense. Thank you very much, Your Holiness.
Francisco Varela, Richard Davidson, and others invited scientifically trained Mathieu Ricard, who had received a PhD in molecular genetics before he became a monk, to help them craft the experimental design.
All these are the scientific sort of the research work. Oh, wonderful.
Now you bring into the laboratory somebody like Matthew. Complete, stable mind, no distractions, no thoughts. So when the stimulus comes, he's always ready. And the results are completely different. Meditators who are experienced, the masters of precisely being able to become aware of what happens in their minds. These first-person methods are a radical departure from classical science. One is disembodied, impersonal. The other one is fully embodied, totally situated. So here we have an occasion to really bring very much into the hardcore of research in science that idea. Why? Because this is interesting for science, the question of how to study consciousness. Both of them can give us knowledge. In both of them, you can have good science.
They found this is certain sort of knowledge. Oh, wonderful. It's not just speculation, but they actually found approved through experiment.
This is an image of her brain if we split the brain in half like that. Now, we are going to do a demonstration for you, Your Holiness. So you can see actually that the areas are much more extensive during mental activity. Yes. Well, actually, in dreaming, the brain is very active. And that has been studied with these techniques. And there is activation in all of the sensory areas. So actually, that's very true.
With the MRI, we get spatial resolution, so very fine spatial resolution. With the EEG, we get time resolution, things that are very fast. With this, we're after chemical resolution and chemical selectivity. That's the real advantage of using this particular imaging versus something else. We can be very selective about the chemistry that we look at.
Then the instrument itself, also wonderful, very sophisticated. Oh, wonderful. Must be very expensive.
Unexpectedly, just months before they were to meet again in person, Francisco Varela's health failed him for the final time. He lost his long struggle with liver cancer. He became terminally ill.
Our last conversation, not face to face, but through modern technology, through video, from medicine to Paris. That's very moving.
Good morning, my dear friend. And in some sense, I also consider you as a spiritual brother.
I was with Francisco when the Dalai Lama called. He could no longer move, he could no longer talk, but he was watching so strongly the screen with the Dalai Lama speaking to him that I thought he was going to dive into the screen as if it were a swimming pool. He was in the screen with him, and it was a very, very moving moment for everyone who was there.
So I wanted to express my deep feeling to you as a human brother, and your contribution in science, I think you made, especially in the neurology, you made great sort of contribution. And then also in our work, some kind of dialogue between science and Buddhist, I think science of mind, and also some other field. I think you made great contribution. So we never forget that. Till my death, I will remember you.
1 year later, Francisco's wife and son met with the Dalai Lama in remembrance.
How old are you?
10.
10. So before you come to this world, I already know your father. So great, really great.
The Dalai Lama told me that he always has this photo of Francisco with him and that he takes it with him whenever he travels, wherever he goes, to this day still.
And then the Dalai Lama reaffirmed his personal commitment to driving forward the collaboration between Buddhist science and Western science in the years ahead. In 2003, the Dalai Lama opened up his conversations with scientists to the public with a groundbreaking conference at one of the most prestigious scientific research universities in the world, MIT.
In 1998, we added collaborative research to our mission. And by that, what we had in mind was a true collaboration between Buddhism and science, where scientists and Buddhists would stand shoulder to shoulder and design the scientific protocols, recruit the subjects, execute the research, analyze the results together, and publish together.
All of our public meetings have been co-sponsored by major research universities, starting with MIT, and then with Georgetown, Johns Hopkins Medical Institute, Emory, the Mayo Clinic, University of Zurich. That really has gotten credibility and acceptance.
We're going to explain a few things about how mental imagery is being used as part of an effort of personal transformation.
We'll be talking about introspection and mechanism of mental imagery. And let me start off by pointing out that I have to be extremely humble. That was a fantastic talk we just heard, and it reminded me of how little we know in the scientific community, just how narrow and focused we've been. Hopefully, we're starting to build a brick that can contribute to the wall, but we really must be modest. So with that preface, let me talk about what we've discovered.
The Dalai Lama spoke before an overflow crowd of 14,000 at the annual meeting of the Society for Neuroscience, despite a petition started by some Chinese neuroscientists to ban him from speaking. And in 2014, the Dalai Lama was invited to speak at one of the world's foremost medical research centers, the National Institute of Health, where he was greeted with a standing ovation.
I don't think I can recall ever seeing this auditorium this full. And I've been at NIH for 20 years. So that says something about the person who is sitting to my left, who I think all of you want to hear from, His Holiness the Dalai Lama. His Holiness saw a demonstration just a few minutes ago of a 13-year-old girl with cerebral palsy who is in our rehabilitation lab with some very high-tech analyses of how her motor problems connect with what's going on in the brain and how training on the elliptical and some other things they're doing is improving her legs functioning and maybe reprogramming the motor part of her brain.
The controller is here. So controller damage, then is movement difficult. So now I learned training here, change controller.
Ultimately, scientific research should bring some benefit to humanity. The company or concerned people who made this, I really very much appreciate. And you now, you see, can tell them how useful this, and then in I think Europe, I think comparatively better facility. But look, Africa,
Yeah.
many poor people, and then less developed country, suffering, immense. And during 21st century, the scientists, technologists really develop a wonderful sort of invention.
So you can touch.
But your forehead.
That's this device here.
See all the values.
Yes.
And
And it worked. Great sort of research, out of scientific research and technology also. Wonderful. Wonderful.
The Dalai Lama collected a prestigious award today for his unique contribution in engaging with multiple dimensions of science. The John Templeton Foundation stated that for decades, the Dalai Lama has focused on the connections between the investigative traditions of science and Buddhism, specifically by encouraging scientific reviews of the power of compassion and its potential to address the world's fundamental problems. The Templeton Award, which was established over 40 years ago, claims to be the world's largest yearly monetary award. The Dalai Lama says that he intends to donate it to help impoverished children in India and also to fund further scientific research and investigation.
The Dalai Lama continued to collaborate with many scientists, including Richard Davidson.
If it weren't for these dialogues, I think I wouldn't have found some key insights. It's been deeply important and meaningful, and I think that it will transform science. Neuroplasticity simply means that the brain changes in response to experience and in response to training. Most of the time, the brain is changing unwittingly. Recent evidence suggests that the average American adult spends 47% of her or his waking life not paying attention to what they're doing. Now what you see here is the expression of high-amplitude gamma oscillations. These gamma oscillations, when they're seen in normal human beings, are typically very brief, less than 1 second in duration. But we observe them continuously at high amplitude in these long-term meditation practitioners. These are oscillations which are associated with states of focused attention, as well as periods of insight, when different elements of a percept or an idea come together in a kind of momentary insight. Then you see a burst of gamma. Now this is very interesting. We have, for the very first time, a technology which allows us to actually look at epigenetic changes in human brain tissue. We can take a blood cell and we can convert that cell into a pluripotent stem cell. We can then turn it into any other kind of cell in the body. And one of the things that we can do in a dish is that we can turn it into any kind of neuron that we find in the human brain. And then we can look at gene expression in that neuronal stage. And so this is going to usher in a whole new era of investigation that enables us to look with much greater specificity at the brain than ever before. It is also important to know that there are 3 major periods of increased plasticity in the brain. One is right around birth. The second is around the onset of schooling, between the ages of 5 and 7 years. And the third is around adolescence. These are periods where the brain is radically reorganized, and these are all opportunities for intervention.
The Dalai Lama also worked closely for many years with other scientists, like Paul Ekman. In 2016, they launched their comprehensive map of human emotions.
If I heard you correctly, Your Holiness, you are talking about a map of emotions.
Yes. We human beings, this marvelous intelligence, either, you see, become source of happiness or source of worry. You have all the facilities, but at the same time, can be very, very unhappy person.
We met every week for almost 2 years, trying to figure out how can we use graphics to give us insight into our emotions. How can we map them? The process of creating the map, of answering the questions that he kept raising about how to do it, how it should be shown, made me think about emotions in a way I hadn't thought of up until then. After 50 years of studying emotion, because of emotions, we may starve ourselves to death. Because of emotions, we may take our own life. That the fundamental drives are puny compared to the power of emotions which override them. They are what drives life.
We must so utilize a deeper level of our ability to think, to tackle our emotions.
The scientific dialogues continued, and they covered molecular biology and genetics.
What I'm going to talk about essentially is how parents alter the activity of genes in the brain and how that influences the way their children respond to stress. And in particular, what I'd like to talk about, and that component that may be somewhat new, is how it is that the influence of parents can persist potentially over the entire lifespan. The idea is that, as I mentioned, parental care alters the activity of genes in the brain, and that these effects are very specific. And the second component of this, these parental effects actually involve a form of plasticity. But this plasticity is different. It doesn't involve connections between neurons. The modifications actually occur at the level of the gene itself, and that there is an organization of the chemical environment in which the gene operates, and that is the effect that then sustains itself over the lifespan.
They began to collaborate.
And what was so impressive, I think, was the overlay between Buddhist philosophy and cognitive behavioral therapy. And what I wanted to do was to try to bring that into a particular context. What we're understanding is that many forms of illness and disease is shaped first by events that occur early in life, and second, it is shaped by various forms of family experience. And I'd like yourself and members of the audience to simply imagine life as a child growing up in a family with drug abuse, unemployment, financial stress, and physical and sexual abuse. And emotionally, they then become people who are very sensitive to threat. For these children, their anger is not wrong. It is very adaptive. We've created an environment in which the child must normally be angry. And one of the problems that we face in medicine, and particularly in psychiatry, is how do we reach out to those children? How do we deal with that form of anger?
Of course, related to this is the question which Solinus was saying that he has been often asking and interested, that as a result of brain changes at the brain level, there is a manifestation of changes at the psychological and emotional level. Yes, that's uncontentious. But can one also imagine the reversal process, where as a result of a thought process, change in the thought process, one could see a change on the brain level as well?
The optimism here is that these can occur, and that the dialogue involved in cognitive behavioral therapy or in Buddhist philosophy there is the prospect of changing at the level of the gene itself. There is the prospect.
I think a lot of our problem, not necessarily created by technology itself, but anger, hatred, fear.
I had the honor to spend a week in Dharamshala at the invitation of His Holiness for a remarkable meeting, The Nature of Life, and it was a truly remarkable experience. It was a discussion we were having to do about embryonic stem cells. And it was offered from the Buddhist perspective that the Abhidharma mentions that through the meeting of two regenerative substances, of the mother and the father, consciousness enters and the being then becomes sentient, from which you might reason that the being becomes a sentient immediately at fertilization, and that there would therefore be very serious problems with working with such a cell. And that was the opening position, the opening thought. And as more scientific discussion went back and forth about this point, it emerged that yes, but if you took embryos and separated the cells, you got two people, not one. And if you implanted an embryo, there was no guarantee that you would even get a single person. You might get none, because most embryos spontaneously abort. And so maybe it wasn't so simple. And maybe, in fact, and it was just a remarkable moment for me as a scientist hearing the Buddhists and His Holiness discussing this, maybe, in fact, there was a different interpretation there, and maybe there was no negative karma associated with experimentation at that point.
I think our knowledge about consciousness, time passes, I think will increase. This is my feeling.
Right now in the West, people are trying to write about the ethical questions in genetics. And I hope that the monks here and yourself don't feel like you have to wait. I know several of the monks have said, well, I have so much to learn and so much to learn. You also have so much to teach.
Still, a lot of things to further develop. So combination or discussion, you see, help to extend knowledge, and field of scientific research also now can expand.
The Dalai Lama supported opening the field of contemplative neuroscience to a new generation.
I'm a neuroscientist, and I did my PhD in postdoctoral work at Emory University. And they suggested that I go to the Summer Research Institute. And then following on that, I was able to get a grant to do a research study, a neuroimaging study on meditation. And so that really launched my career into a different direction. The Summer Research Institute is really instrumental in this whole field. They bring in a lot of the senior researchers and scholars and a lot of the younger graduate students and postdocs that are coming up. And the idea is to really foster our development.
Young scientists who attend the Summer Research Institute are eligible to apply for a $20,000 Varela grant. More than $63 million in follow-on grant research funding in the field of contemplative neuroscience has been raised as a result.
If you put out a request for papers to a conference, who should be allowed to speak? If you're a young person and you're just getting your feet wet, you may actually be making a fool of yourself when you get up and give your poster paper or your presentation. But actually, that's part of growing into the field. There's a nurturing that you can do of a community through inclusion in a conference.
Amishi's lab was awarded a Varela grant in 2006.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? All right. See my face? Okay. The Dalai Lama's intervention allows me to take very seriously the wisdom that comes from the Buddhist texts. Even in the conversation I had with him directly during this meeting, it was clear that this terrain he knows well. And in some sense, my results were so familiar to him that he almost thought they were obvious. That's sort of shocking because it's taken us about 70 years of attention research in the field of cognitive neuroscience to really come to a clear answer to some of these questions. And to him, It was what he predicted, it's what he was happy to see, but wasn't surprised by it. It's definitely helped me feel like I have a whole other gold mine of thought to lean on for motivating hypotheses in our studies.
So Buddha himself is made clear, oh, my follower, monks, scholars should not accept my teaching out of faith, but rather thorough investigation and experiment.
But today we have the great privilege of exploring what is one of the greatest mysteries of all, the nature of consciousness, the nature of the mind. Professor Christoph Koch, who's a professor of biology and engineering at Caltech. He is also the chief scientist at the Paul Allen Institute for Brain Science, a remarkable new initiative.
Your Holiness, I have the great responsibility of representing 2,300 years of Western thought on this in 1 hour. This tradition reaches back all the way to the Greeks in Western thought. It's this tradition that stresses the empirical coring of nature. You can think about things, but ultimately you have to test them against reality. And your theories, including theories of consciousness, have to be testable. Otherwise, they're not scientific theories. When I spent a week with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, I was struck by how often he talked about the need to reduce the suffering of all conscious creatures, and not just all people. That highly organized matter, such as my brain, such as your brain, such as the brains of other creatures, comes with conscious experience. I was struck by particular types of meditation. You can have what Buddhists call a naked awareness, pure experience, Shi experience. When you're conscious, so you're not asleep, you're conscious, but there's no content, there's no desire, no dream, no fear, no ego, no sensory messages, but you're still conscious. Pure consciousness, very interesting.
More and more, there was strong and growing support for the concept of allowing young Buddhist scholars who had mastered these techniques of controlling their own minds to also be trained as scientists themselves.
I think now, at more than 10 years, we start selected monk student and special sort of class for science.
I will just make a brief outline how we are overseeing many of the science initiatives that are taking place due to the guidance of His Holiness. The Science for the Monks is an initiative since year 2001 that was followed by the Sacred Science Leadership. The leadership program came into being because we felt that it's important not only to give the basic science education, but also to create a network of science teachers or others who do the field work in different monasteries.
Many science teachers, they're very much impressed. These monk students do not know English, they do not know mathematics, but their way to thinking, to analyze, is very sharp.
In 2006, when Your Holiness invited us to collaborate with the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives to develop this program, that was a great honor for Emory University. Certainly, a program like this, its aim is not only to impart modern science education for the Tibetan monks and nuns, but His Holiness's vision here is to prepare the future contemplative collaborators with the science so that new knowledge can be formed, which can have a tremendous benefit for the humanity at large.
And then monk students themselves also gradually, they really found not only just interest, but something very useful.
Extensive science curriculum has been created and translated. Many Tibetan monks have been trained over years at Emory University to become science teachers for the project, and new science centers have been created at all of the leading Tibetan monasteries in India. For the first time in 2,000 years, a dramatic change has been made in Tibetan monastic education. Science has officially become a required course of study.
And we can implement knowledge from Buddhist science and Buddhist philosophy, then we can create a collaboration of knowledge which can have a very positive outcome. Although the outcome may not appear immediately, in the long run, there will be great results and great progress. And I see it as a contribution to the future generations and humanity as a whole.
The Dalai Lama also encouraged the development of new scientifically based education curriculum for youth. A conference was held in 2018 for the presentation of some model programs.
And so your office extended an invitation to individuals around the world to think about building curricula that have an ethical dimension to them. And this is where Jennifer Knox and her colleagues in the group at Emory have been doing some really fundamental work. And their program is called the SEE program, Social, Emotional, and Ethical Learning.
3 focuses of inner focus and emotional intelligence, other focus, social intelligence, and outer focus, systems intelligence. Many individuals who are in our culture have experienced trauma. And so without developing some fundamental skills of regulating the nervous system, the students are not often able to even move into a meditation. And the breath can often be a trigger for that former trauma. So we've built in an entire chapter based on building skills of resilience.
Scientifically based on the breakthroughs that have been made in the fields of cognitive science, epigenetics, and neuroscience over the past 30 years, the SEE program teaches effective coping skills, strategies that can be used to regulate emotion, and strategies to gain focus.
Now the modern knowledge, education, not adequate to bring happy society. We create some problem, disagreement. Then the solution, we put the responsibility of the solution on done. Totally wrong.
The SEE program has been translated into 12 different languages. And in April of 2019, the Dalai Lama launched the program worldwide.
This is our 30th dialogue.
30 occasions where we have sat with His Holiness, scientists, philosophers, scholars, and contemplatives, investigating the relationship between Buddhist science and modern science. We also want to acknowledge your dear friend, Francisco Varela, whose vision made it possible in a very powerful way for all of us to be together. And to greet Amy Varela, where are you, Amy, who is president of the board of Mind and Life Europe.
Creating bridges through dialogue is not a quick and straightforward process. To participate in a true dialogue, you must bring to it the whole of yourself. You must expect that building a bridge may be slow, difficult, even threatening at times. Its essence is in its dynamical and open nature, which is a necessary condition for something really new to emerge from it. And the active ingredient in the production of something radically new is personal commitment, absolute presence through compassion and friendship, gentle bridges, true dialogue between the Western and the Buddhist traditions for investigating the nature of reality.
The Dalai Lama continued to push for the expansion of dialogue with other scientists from many other parts of the world, from Africa to Japan, with Russian scientists, and with Chinese scientists.
Now we are going to have one meeting with Chinese scientists. This is first time, so there is real potential. Yes. Now here we are few people, but we are representing billions of people. Okay, and that not academic, but world passing through some kind of crisis of emotion. That emotion will not go away by prayer, but training our mind. In order to train our mind, we should have fuller knowledge about the whole system of our emotion and mind.
We'll certainly welcome you in Taiwan, and we will initiate a continual discussion in Taiwan sometime.
Thank you.
On his 80th birthday, the Dalai Lama publicly reaffirmed his commitment to stand shoulder to shoulder with scientists as they tackle the toughest issues facing humanity.
I'm a simple Buddhist monk, but at the same time, eventually I become very close with scientists. In our training, reason become very important. So this scientific way, it compels us now think how to utilize their findings, translate into action, new ideas, new way. Scientists really showing practical, genuine interest, try to make a better world. But this is the sign of our progress. So therefore, remain a little bit skeptical. Then skepticism brings doubt. Doubt brings investigation. Buddha stated, "All my follower, monks, scholars, should not accept my teaching out of faith, out of devotion, but rather thorough investigation and experiment. Through that way, once you are convinced, then you accept my teaching." So this quite sort of scientific way. So therefore, my body is this person, half Buddhist monk, half scientist.